This is me and Teddy. And that was my real first relationship, first person that I fell in love with. But this is not a happy memory. I actually remember this day, and I was kind of leaning away from him because this was not too long after one of the times that he actually put his hands on me. I just look so uncomfortable. I'm just not happy at all. And he was trying to overcompensate for that by being more affectionate. And I think I just was so naive at that point in life that I just kind of took it to the extreme, and I didn't realize how broken he was. And the fact that a 17, 18-year-old girl at that point could not fix that. If I could change bringing Teddy into my life, I would do anything to change that. And now that I realize that, it's like, damn, like, sorry. Well, this is my high school graduation photo. My grandma, she came from DC, so my dad was really happy. My sisters came, my mom. This is probably one of his proudest days. I can kind of even see it just on his face. I did graduate with honors. I had a 3.9. So I got like a special cord for my ROTC achievements also. And then I was part of one of our like school clubs for our academics. So I also got a cord for that one. So they were really, really proud this day. I'm like, wow, this is great. I'm finally like, I made it. I love my dad so much. He was just like the rock of our family. He would randomly throughout the week, we would go play basketball. But after a while, I started to get better. So he's like, okay, I'm gonna take you and we're gonna play, but I'm gonna like watch from over here. And he would just show me little things. Like he showed me how to change an oil filter, how to change my own oil, how to change a tire. He would always tell us like, if I'm ever not here, you know, I wanna make sure that you'll be able to take care of yourself and do these things. He always sacrificed for us. For me, my mom, my sisters, our whole family, really anybody he cared about, he sacrificed so much. It was very disappointing for me to have to leave the Air Force Academy. I was very hurt, like I was like heartbroken. I called my parents from Colorado crying. They gave me the opportunity to leave, go home, and come back and, you know, just restart next year with the next class. But then that summer is when me and Teddy started dating. When I first realized my feelings towards Teddy, there were definitely the butterflies and just little things that, you know, anything new that he might say or do would, you know, just make me feel, I don't know, like just butterflies, I guess. So it was good at first. It's almost like Teddy was like an outcast in his family. They just didn't treat him like my family treats each other. It made me feel bad. It made me feel like, you know, anytime someone needs help, I just want to help. So when I saw him, you know, having these family issues, I'm like, okay, maybe I can help. Something that I thought would be a good thing backfired. I think it makes me so emotional because I just wish I could go back to that time. That was like such a pivotal point. I feel like if I would have just made one different decision, that maybe everything that happened with Teddy wouldn't have happened. One day I remember my dad had told me that he saw Teddy at a fast food restaurant. He walked into the restaurant, he saw Teddy. He was there with another female. They were holding hands. This was maybe about 6 months or so after I had told my parents that me and Teddy were dating. So I did ask Teddy about the whole girl at the fast food restaurant. And of course, he claimed that it was just his friend. He gave me this whole speech and, you're the only person I want to be with. It was kind of like a love bombing of words. I covered for Teddy so many times, especially, I tried to do everything I could to make him not look like the type of person that he was clearly showing everyone he was. I didn't want to accept the fact that the person that I thought I was in love with at the time was possibly doing something wrong. Teddy had gotten in a few fights before we met, so I just heard, about how he could be a little confrontational. And I think I definitely should have paid that more attention, but I didn't see it as necessarily a red flag at that time. So I remember this night, me and Teddy, we were with a bunch of friends, and there was this guy just being overly pushy.
Yo, what's up?
He was just like, what's your number, what's your name? And just not letting it go when we ignored him.
I just want to know your name.
Teddy zooms over and he's like, what's up? Like, you messing with my girlfriend, da, da, da. So they get into it. Teddy just hit him one time and knocked him out. Everybody was just like this whole big thing. Everybody's like, oh my gosh. That was the first time I saw him hurt somebody. And I feel like at that moment in time, I'm like, okay, maybe your bad reputation could, protect me somehow. Like, he's a protector kind of person. So in my mind, I'm thinking like, okay, maybe this is like my dad. I thought, okay, maybe I can help him change. I see these bad things, but that doesn't mean you have to be a bad person forever. Because now that I'm older, I'm like, okay, you could have de-escalated that situation differently. I definitely should have taken that as a red flag. I think back then I thought of it as, this like grand thing that you've done for me. Like, oh, you protected me. Like, oh wow, like how, But now it was kind of almost a form of control, I feel like. Kind of using that situation to make me feel safe, even though I wasn't really safe with him. When we first started dating, Teddy had got in a few fights, just some negative situations back then. At that point, his temper, nothing had got better. We were starting to argue here and there. And yeah, my parents found out a couple times about the altercations I got in because of Teddy, and, they were upset, and I was disappointed in myself. That's when it just really started to be like, okay, this isn't what I thought it was gonna be. I broke up with him and I started dating someone else. I went to a party one night with the guy that I started, recently talking to after I cut Teddy off. The next thing I hear, someone's like, oh, Teddy's outside. In my mind, I'm like, maybe it's a coincidence. But then they're like, he's not just like outside chilling, like he's outside with a bat. Me and a couple of my homegirls, walked over to Teddy and were like, what are you doing? Like, what's all this about?
What are you doing here?
I came here to get you. We're leaving.
Teddy basically told me I'm leaving with him. He was coming there to show either me or the new guy I was trying to talk to that, like, oh, you can't have her type of thing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, he's coming here and he's gonna beat up the guy that I just started talking to for no reason.
Practice school, wide open. He's a dead man.
Either I get in the car or it's gonna be some sort of altercation. This is what's gonna satisfy him, let me just do it.
Okay. Come on.
It was scary at the time. He begged and pleaded, please talk to me, we can make it work. It was almost like an apology, but almost like you have no choice but to forgive me and take me back. I ended up leaving with him that night. We talked and I decided to take him back. I believed the things he told me about how he would change and what he would change. I saw the things that were wrong, but I didn't think that it would become an aggression towards me. He was so, already into controlling me that there was nothing else I could do to leave him alone. That probably wouldn't have resulted in something bad happening. So yeah, it's a lot of weight to carry and I need to release it somehow, but it's easier said than done. The whole reasoning behind moving to Greenville with Teddy was to try to get him away from all of the bad things that he was doing. I just felt like he had so much more potential. When we first moved in together, it was good, but then things changed after that. One day, we were kind of in the common area of the house and just going back and forth, arguing.
No, you need to start contributing.
It was kind of just a regular argument, but I said something and he just kind of came rushing at me. That's at that point when he pushed me down and started choking me on the floor. I'm like, what's going on? I couldn't really fight back. It just happened so fast. And I, look at him in his face, it's anger. It doesn't look like he's in control. He would call me a bitch or, you or just anything that he could to degrade me as much as possible in that moment. And then I also thought, if you try to fight back, he might hurt you even worse. So I just kind of let it happen and just waited for it to be over. Probably held me down for at least 15 seconds, long enough to where I literally had no air left in my lungs. I thought, okay, I'm about to pass out. And that's when he released me and I sat there for a while. I didn't move. I just never experienced so much hate from someone before. Just the feeling that I felt in that moment when it was actually happening, I could feel hatred. I'm in my mind, I could have just died. By the time he did come back, he helped me get up and brought me some water, and he was very apologetic, he was crying. So I think it was just him trying to persuade me that he was so sorry that it wouldn't happen again. He knew I had a good heart, and he used that to his advantage. And I didn't want to call and tell my parents because I thought, oh, this was only one time. And if I call the police on him, we'll never be together again. I just tried to keep it between us and protect him yet again. I thought, okay, this was just a mistake. I didn't die. It's okay. It'll be okay. It's kind of what I told myself, and not knowing that this was going to become a whole thing at that point. They told us that they would be searching the house. At that time, Teddy was dealing with different things with people's bank accounts, and he had the credit cards that weren't in his name. They ended up first arresting Teddy. I was arrested for possession of stolen goods since the credit cards that Teddy had were actually in my room. At that moment, that's when it kind of really hit me like, what is going on? I'm like, this is not how my life was supposed to turn out. I'm like, I did everything, growing up just to make sure that this moment didn't happen. It kind of was like a reality check. And it made me really look at Teddy like, okay, is it you? Like, are you the reason why these bad things are happening to me? I've never had this happen before. The only thing I was worried about was how disappointed my parents were gonna be. That next day, my parents were supposed to be driving to come to this really big honors award ceremony at ECU. You guys are supposed to be picking me up to go to this ceremony, and instead, you're picking me up from the county jail. It really put things, I think, into perspective for me at that point. I was definitely ashamed. I was embarrassed. My dad blamed Teddy for the arrest because I never had a history of getting into trouble or really just doing anything wrong. He felt like had I not been with Teddy, my life would have been taking a different turn at that point. I saw something in him that I wanted him to see in himself. And instead of me changing him into that person that I thought he could become, it's like he slowly started changing me into the person that he wanted me to be and the person really that he was. Teddy ended up getting 6 months that he had to serve in jail, and I got about 18 months of probation. Honestly, once he went to jail, I moved back with my parents. So my dad, he definitely was just supportive, no matter what. At the same time that he's consoling me, giving me a hug, oh, it's okay. He's also telling me okay, it's okay, but you need to figure out what you're gonna do. So it was I'm okay, now I need to figure out the next step. Kind of saw how life could be without Teddy, and it was actually a lot better. So I just saw a lot of positive changes, and as soon as he got back out, everything just went back downhill again. So this is when we went out one of those times to the country. I didn't really think anything of it at that time. But after putting it into perspective, it's what were you practicing for? He always made sure he had a gun from the time that we first started dating. He was actually very insecure. Probably the most insecure person I've ever met. He did like to come off as the tough guy. I think that he thought that made him look like a macho man or the cool dude. And the guns didn't make me nervous until close to the end. Right after that time, after Teddy got out of jail, we were starting to argue here and there. All the negative things were really starting to kind of show themselves more. We got into an argument, probably, again, something minor. He tried to push my head into the trash can. It was just bleeding as soon as he did it. And instead of him, are you okay? Or get me a towel or anything, he went to the room and started packing his stuff and panicking. And meanwhile, I'm just, sitting on the floor bleeding. He was more concerned with himself getting in trouble than the fact that he just gashed my head open. This photo is probably a day or two after the day that Teddy bashed my head into the kitchen counter. So that's the scar, and I had to get like 5 stitches. It wasn't like a direct, like, don't tell anybody. It was more so like him putting it into the scenario of, well, if you tell somebody, I'm gonna go to jail, I'm gonna get in trouble. He knows how much I care, so instead of him saying, oh, don't tell on me because this or that, he's making me feel like I would be the one holding him back if I told on him. It's like he was playing this mind game because he knew I wanted the best for him. You know, he was a master manipulator. So when my mom asked what happened to my forehead, I actually told her that I slipped on a rug in the kitchen and I fell and I hit my head, and that was kind of the story. She didn't believe it because she knows that I was an athlete my whole life and I never really had clumsy spells where I just tripped or fell. It just solidified exactly what I already said in my head, that this will never work. I have to find a way out. Like the main kind of argument when it's a domestic violence relationship is, oh, why didn't you just leave? And it's really not that easy. You can literally just take your feet and walk away, but who's to say that once you do that, that person's actually gonna leave you alone? But you never know what might be around that corner. I had this gut feeling that the day you try to leave him, he's gonna find a way to hurt you even worse. And he's gonna knock on my mom's door, and then he's gonna shoot my mom, and then he's gonna knock on my sister's door and shoot her and all my nieces and nephews and my other sister. That was literally what played out in my head of what would happen if I left him. So I'm just like, to avoid all that, I'll just stay and deal with whatever it is that he may do, because that's better than what I, in my gut, feel like is the outcome is gonna be. After that incident, my parents really noticed what all had been going on. So at that point, that's when, my dad was like, no, he can't do this. And I want to, go forward with pressing charges. But I didn't want to leave him. But there was nothing that my dad could actually do. So he did try, but me being of age, you can't really, call for somebody else. So it was just kind of like he felt helpless. So one day we were at the townhouse. Somebody knocked on our door. The police officer came to me and Teddy's townhouse. Teddy was like, why is the police here? He was very paranoid, and I kind of went into like a panic because Teddy, mind you, is right there with both of his guns. Like he always does when he doesn't know who somebody is that comes to the house. He has both of his guns in his hand. And I walked out the door, and the cop, he has no idea.
Hi, ma'am.
And I'm just panicking, kind of trying to figure out how to get rid of the cop without telling him that Teddy is standing behind the door with a gun. Well, your dad wanted me to come and check on you. So I was like, I'm like, yes, I'm fine, everything's fine. And then I think he could kind of feel that I was trying to be short and rush the conversation. In that moment, when I was talking to the cop, I was convinced that Teddy would shoot him right then and there and not care at all, just to save himself. I just kept assuring him everything's okay.
Okay.
Eventually he ended up leaving. I just knew it couldn't last but so much longer. After 5 years of lying to people about what you've been doing and all these things, and it seems like everything is trying to come to light, I felt like I'm like, okay, my parents know. I'm like, okay, the police came by. So I'm like, okay, maybe this is the time where I need to finally figure out how to leave him alone. But it was just no more rope left at that point. Oh, this is Fat Boy. This is our puppy that we got. And yeah, I love Fat Boy. He was cool. He was a really good dog. He didn't really do much. But I was like, okay, that's just you. I'm like, that's your personality. I'm like, you like it, I love it. When we went and got the dog, it was Teddy's idea. He was in love, I was in love. But as time faded, a couple months went by and he just started to treat Fat Boy different. He wouldn't feed him. He would actually beat the dog. He, eventually ended up killing him. After probably 30 minutes or so after I saw Fat Boy, I cried. I went upstairs and cried first. I didn't want to watch him bury Fat Boy, so I ended up just leaving the house for the day so I didn't have to watch that. And when I got back, he just acted like nothing happened, like everything was normal and just go on about life, so. He saw that I had something else that I cared about and it wasn't him, and he got jealous, even though it's a dog. He got jealous of the dog, and it made me a lot more fearful of him and the things that he would be capable of. I used to watch a lot of crime stuff, and they always said that, people that have these real issues, they start off with animals. That stuck in my head, that he was kind of on a pathway to more than an animal. And it did scare me. I looked at him completely different. I think that the thing that I asked for the most was to just be able to safely get away from him, and my family also. And I could never see a way, no matter how many different scenarios I would put together in my head, no matter how many different ways I would think of how to possibly leave him, it always ended with him hurting somebody that I cared about. I was more okay with something happening to me than something happening to my family. I didn't want the person that I brought into their life to hurt them. So right around the beginning of 2020, after everything happened with Fat Boy, me and Teddy broke up. So there was one time me and Teddy were actually arguing and he again choked me to the point where I had, bruises around my neck from his hands, and then my face was purple and blue blotchy. And then he takes the broomstick and starts beating me with the broom. After that, I got up and I started packing my stuff.
You get your ass up here!
He screamed at me to come upstairs. And something just went off in my head like, don't go upstairs. I don't know why, I'm just like, no. I'm like, I'm not coming upstairs.
Dreamer!
I'm like, okay, yeah, he's about to get his gun and he's about to come down here and kill me. Is what I was thinking, and the only way I thought I was gonna make it out of the house is just by turning around, going out the front door and making a run for it.
Where are you?
It was just this overwhelming feeling. Just don't talk to him, don't say anything, just run. And that's what I did.
Dreamer!
When I finally make it out of the house, I've made it far enough out of his eyesight to where I can now call somebody to come and pick me up and I can get away from him.
Dreamer! Dream!
A little bit of time goes by, I call my dad. I tell him, what happened. And he said immediately, he's like, I'm on the way, where are you at? I started to hear Teddy's car. I would just kind of try to duck or move to the side or see if I could see him and position myself to where he can't see me. So I did hide all the way until, my dad made it to me. I get in the car, we pull off.
He was just here. We gotta go.
We probably didn't make it like 500 feet. We make a right, and Teddy is coming.
That's him!
Teddy literally swerves into our lane head on, so we hit each other head on. And I'm looking at him in this moment when our cars are just literally touching like this. And I look at him and I say, what the are you doing? Stop. He didn't stop. And in that moment, I saw him pop his trunk, and I told my dad he has a gun. Teddy had already got out of his car with his rifle, knowing what he was about to do. I did get out of the car to try to run and stop him, but I couldn't make it to him fast enough. And he shot my dad. And at that point, when I did run around the car towards Teddy, he actually stopped shooting at my dad for a second and pointed at me. And I looked at him and he didn't shoot me. He just went back to shooting at my dad. By the time I got to him, I grabbed it, and it's like he just kind of snapped out of it. I didn't really think about it. It was, my first instinct was just save my dad.
Dad, come on, stay with me.
At that point, I'm thinking that, there's still some chance that he would be alive.
I love you. Dad!
I did actually hear my dad take his last breath. I told him I loved him, and that's when I heard like the last sound, like he was trying to say it back, but he couldn't. And that was it. I was just screaming at the top of my lungs. I was just in shock. I didn't really understand what had just happened. And Teddy, he asked me if I would take $100,000 to tell the police that he was protecting himself against my dad. The audacity you must have to say something like that to somebody after what you just did leads me to believe even more just how evil he is, because how could you do that to somebody and then turn around and make it seem like money could fix that? I could only think about one thing at that point, and that was the fact that my dad was sitting there lifeless because of him. I've been trying to make it make sense, and no matter what I come up with for why he did it, it doesn't make sense. And if you wanted to hurt me, why didn't you shoot me too? So this is Teddy 4 years after being arrested. The nothingness, the soullessness is still there. I know for a fact he's not coping well in prison. I've actually spoken to people that have seen him in prison, and he's not doing good. I'm not afraid of what's gonna happen when he gets out of prison in 35 years, but he should be afraid of what's gonna happen when he gets out of prison. This is me and my dad when I was probably in like 5th grade. We went out to DC. We would just go random places sometimes, like without really anything to do or any plan. Yeah, he was a very caring person, just in general. And I guess maybe that's where I get it from. My dad did everything he could to protect me, my sisters, my mom. If he was given the opportunity to know what the outcome would be, he would do it again. He was fearless. So this is my dad. Um, we got him cremated. This was his wishes. He always said that he didn't want to be um, buried in the ground. So, um, sorry. He always said he didn't want to be in the ground, and he was always that person that liked to be different places and moving around and stuff. So we promised him that one day we would get his ashes spread all over the world, and we piece by piece we've been doing that. So that's what we did, and just like with our necklaces, like right now he's in he's in Texas, he's in Georgia, he's in North Carolina, he's everywhere right now. So I think he's somewhere sitting watching me right now. So. So this is another little urn. So we put some of his ashes in here. So if we just want to, take him with us, if we go somewhere that can't take, all of him, we can always take our little urn. So we always have him with us. Yeah, definitely my guardian angel now. I just feel that he's always with me. Like it just gives me motivation to do things I probably wouldn't have done, and I know that that's him. I do still talk to my dad all the time. Whenever I have like a good accomplishment, I'll like Dad, guess what? Like this just happened. Or if I'm really probably especially when I'm sad, I'll definitely always just make sure I say something to him. Even when I'm just feeling okay, I'll just sometimes just talk to him. I know he's listening.
This is Teresa. She looks scary. This woman had no emotion for me, her child. She was ripping my innocence away from me and using it against me. If my own mother couldn't love me, then who could?
Shadows possess a terrible weight. In our modern era, we have largely forgotten how heavy the night can truly be, banishing it to the periphery of our lives with the constant, humming glow of neon, street lamps, and light-emitting diodes. But to understand the sheer, suffocating terror that paralyzed a booming American metropolis in the late 19th century, you must first strip away the light. You must return to a time before the towering halos of electricity kept the darkness at an arm's length. You must stand in the thick, wet mud of a moonless night, where the only illumination bleeds from the faint, trembling glow of an oil lamp behind a distant, rain-streaked window pane, and the only sound is the rhythmic, unforgiving strike of winter weather against a fragile wooden roof. This is not the fog-choked labyrinth of London, though the cobblestones of Whitechapel will soon run red in a manner eerily similar to the tale that is about to unfold. This is not the hunting ground of Jack the Ripper. This is something older, something perhaps more primal, and it happened first. It happened in the heart of Texas. The year is 1884. The city of Austin is a place of profound and rapid metamorphosis, a settlement caught in the chaotic, restless threshold between a rugged frontier past and a gleaming, legislative future. The air is thick with the dust of ambition and the noise of industry. At the very center of this transformation, rising steadily from the Texas soil, is the colossal skeleton of the new Texas State Capitol building. It is a monument to progress, a sprawling architectural marvel designed to project unyielding power, civility, and order across the untamed landscape. The wealthy elite of the city look upon these rising stones with immense pride, viewing Austin as a burgeoning beacon of civilization in the South. But civilization is often nothing more than a fragile veneer, a thin layer of polite society stretched tightly over something ancient and violent. Beneath the grand civic projects and the bustling, optimistic daylight of this era, there exists a deep, unbridgeable fracture, a chasm of race, class, and geography that divides the city as sharply as the blade of a butcher's knife. To comprehend the nature of the nightmare that is about to take root in this soil, one must first examine the very architecture of this divided society. The wealthy white families of Austin reside in grand, opulent mansions that serve as fortresses of comfort. These homes are built with heavy oak doors, thick glass windows, and multiple interlocking rooms that insulate the inhabitants from the harshness of the outside world. Yet, these vast estates do not run themselves. They require an army of invisible hands to maintain the illusion of effortless luxury. These hands belong almost exclusively to women of color, primarily African American women who serve tirelessly as cooks, maids, and laundresses. Their reality is starkly, brutally different from that of their employers. They do not sleep beneath the high, ornate ceilings of the main house. By the rigid, unforgiving social design of the era, they are relegated to the servant quarters. These servant quarters are small, rudimentary wooden structures, deliberately pushed to the absolute furthest edges of the property line. They sit at the rear of deep, sprawling lots, hidden entirely behind dense clusters of trees, positioned near the odorous stables, the dirt alleys, or the far wooden fences. This spatial arrangement is highly intentional, designed to keep the domestic staff close enough for grueling daily labor, but far enough away to maintain a strict, undeniable social segregation. However, this architectural exile creates a fatal, unintended vulnerability. When the sun dips below the horizon and the wealthy homeowners retreat behind their heavy, locked doors, turning the keys and drawing the heavy curtains, the women in the servant quarters are left entirely, desperately isolated. They are marooned on the dark, neglected edges of these vast properties, far removed from the protective ears of the main house. If a scream were to tear through the freezing night air, it would be swallowed instantly by the distance, the wind, and the thick foliage long before it ever reached the masters of the estate. These women are targets hidden in plain sight, perfectly positioned for a predator who deeply understands the topography of the city's shadows. And a predator is indeed watching from those very shadows. He is an entity without a name, a phantom who operates with a chilling, calculated silence that borders on the supernatural. He does not bring weapons to his hunting ground. Doing so would be an unnecessary risk, a disruption of his seamless, ghostly integration into the environment. He does not carry the cold steel of a revolver, for the crack of gunfire would shatter the night and immediately summon the authorities. Instead, he relies on the heavy, blunt tools of labor already scattered casually about the backyards and woodpiles of these very estates. An axe left leaning carelessly against a chopping block. a heavy iron spike used for tethering horses, a discarded brick lying in the weeds. He weaponizes the mundane, everyday objects of his victims' servitude against them, turning the implements of their labor into the instruments of their demise. His patience is matched only by his unimaginable cruelty. He waits with singular focus for the perfect meteorological conditions. He strikes almost exclusively on nights when the moon is completely hidden behind heavy, suffocating banks of black clouds, or when the Texas skies open up, unleashing torrential, freezing rains and howling winds. The storm is his most trusted accomplice, providing both an impenetrable visual cloak and a deafening acoustic shield. In this heavy, oppressive darkness, he moves with a terrifying grace. He actively discards his footwear. Leaving his heavy boots behind, he walks barefoot, or at times in thick damp socks, through the wet, clinging mud, rendering his approach entirely silent. He leaves only the faint, medium-sized indentations of his bare feet in the earth, a ghostly, mocking signature that will soon taunt the frantic, desperate bloodhounds of the local constabulary. The dogs will track his scent to the edge of the property line, only to spin in confused circles as the trail vanishes into thin air. He slips effortlessly through the wrought iron gates, glides unseen past the grand mansions where the elite sleep entirely undisturbed, and makes his inexorable way to the vulnerable wooden shacks at the back of the lot. His motive is an abyss of dark psychology. He is a thief who steals absolutely nothing of monetary value. He effortlessly breaches the perimeters of unimaginable wealth, passing rooms that house silver, jewelry, and cash, yet he never touches a single coin. His obsession is flesh, terror, and absolute control. The physical invasion of the sanctuary is paramount. His singular objective is the sleeping woman in the isolated cabin. The horror begins not with a deafening roar, but with a whisper of displaced air, a creak of a floorboard, a shadow detaching itself from the darker shadows of the room. It begins on a night that is fundamentally supposed to be sacred, a night universally reserved for peace, reflection, and goodwill. It is December 24th, 1884. Christmas Eve. The air in Austin is biting, damp, and perfectly still beneath a pitch-black sky. In a small, detached servant quarter located on the far edge of the property where she works diligently as a cook, a young black woman named Molly Smith lies deeply asleep. Beside her in the narrow bed is her boyfriend, Walter Spencer. They are resting after a long day of exhausting labor, completely unaware that the heavy wooden door of their fragile, isolated sanctuary is about to give way to a nightmare incarnate. The room is enveloped in absolute, impenetrable blackness. There is no warning whatsoever. There is no demanded ransom, no frantic, noisy search for hidden valuables. The intruder who breaches their room operates with terrifying, mechanical precision. In the sudden, chaotic violence of the dark, Walter Spencer is viciously and instantly struck. A heavy, unseen blow crashes into his skull with sickening force, fracturing his head and instantly incapacitating him. As he violently slips into the dark void of unconsciousness, surrounded by the terrifying, wet sounds of a struggle he cannot even see, he is mercifully spared the full visual horror of the attack. His survival is a medical miracle, but it will offer the police no solace and no description of the assailant. When questioned later, his memory will be a blank slate of agony. The darkness of the room was too absolute, the strike too fast. He never saw the face of the devil who entered his room. With Spencer neutralized and bleeding on the floor, the intruder turns his full, terrible attention to Molly Smith. She is violently dragged from the fading warmth of her bed, hauled roughly out of the small room, and pulled out into the freezing, muddy night air. The killer drags her physically past the sprawling main house, where the wealthy owners sleep soundly, oblivious to the atrocity occurring mere yards away, and pulls her forcefully behind the dark silhouette of the stables. It is there, in the cold, wet dirt, hidden entirely from the world, that the true, ritualistic savagery of the crime is finally unleashed. The killer raises an axe, procured from the very yard they stand in, and brings it down upon her head with devastating force. But the violence does not end with the fatal blow. The physical death of Molly Smith is seemingly not enough to satisfy the deep, churning pathology of the attacker. In a deeply disturbing act of post-mortem violation that goes far beyond the mechanics of mere murder, the assailant retrieves a sharp, pointed iron object from the surrounding dirt. With chilling, unhurried deliberation, he drives the rigid spike deep into Molly's ear, forcing it inward with immense pressure until it violently penetrates her brain tissue. Modern criminal psychologists, looking back across the century, would recognize this horrifying detail not as a random act of frenzy, but as a deeply symbolic gesture. It is an act of ultimate silencing. It is a physical manifestation of extreme, total possession, a statement that the killer owns not just the victim's life, but her ability to hear, to speak, to exist. When the pale, gray morning breaks on Christmas Day, the anticipated joy of the holiday is instantly and permanently extinguished by the gruesome discovery behind the stables. The city of Austin wakes not to the cheerful ringing of festive church bells, but to the horrifying, undeniable realization that a monster has walked silently among them. The brutalized, violated body of Molly Smith is not just a localized tragedy, it is a violent proclamation. The sheer, unadulterated viciousness of the attack, coupled with the bizarre, terrifying detail of the iron spike driven deep into her ear, sends an immediate shockwave of primal dread rippling through the entire community. The local authorities are utterly bewildered. The complete lack of theft, the perfectly silent approach, the barefoot tracks vanishing into the mud, the horrific overkill, it defies all known logic of standard criminal behavior in the region. They are accustomed to crimes of passion, drunken brawls, or robberies gone wrong. They have no framework for an apex predator who hunts solely for the psychological thrill of the kill. They do not know it yet, and they could not possibly fathom it on that cold Christmas morning, but this is merely the opening sequence of an agonizing saga. The brutal slaying of Molly Smith is simply the first bloody stroke on a massive canvas of terror that will stretch relentlessly across an entire agonizing year. It will escalate in audacity, it will cross the rigid boundaries of race and class, and it will eventually force the government to attempt to artificially illuminate the night sky itself in a desperate bid for safety. The long, bloody night of 1884 has only just begun, and the proud, ambitious city of Austin is utterly unprepared for the phantom that is hunting in its own backyard. The blood that stained the freezing mud behind the stables on that dark Christmas morning was eventually washed away by the relentless winter rains, but the invisible stain of terror left upon the city of Austin proved impossible to erase. In the immediate aftermath of the horrific murder of the young cook Molly Smith, a fragile and desperate narrative took hold among the wealthy elite and the bewildered local authorities. Human nature, when confronted with the incomprehensible abyss of a motiveless slaughter, frantically seeks the comforting shelter of rationalization. The police, unequipped to recognize the psychological signature of a serial predator, stubbornly clung to the belief that this was an isolated tragedy. They theorized it was merely a targeted assault, perhaps just a brutal domestic dispute veiled entirely in the shadows of the servant quarters. As the bitter, unforgiving chill of January yielded to the subtle, deceptive warmth of the early Texas spring, the affluent citizens desperately willed themselves to believe that the phantom had simply vanished back into the vast wilderness from whence he came. They continued to lock their heavy doors at night, sleep soundly beneath high ceilings, and leave their domestic workers isolated in fragile structures at the distant edges of their properties. This collective denial, this willful blindness to gaping structural vulnerabilities, would soon exact a devastating toll. The predator had not vanished. He was merely waiting patiently in the dark, silently, selecting his next innocent victims. When the phantom broke his agonizing silence in the restless month of March, he introduced a terrifying new dimension to his campaign, shattering the fragile boundaries of safety the city had constructed. The residents of Austin had subconsciously categorized the danger, believing with grim complacency that the killer exclusively targeted the African-American women laboring in the isolated margins. But a monster possesses no loyalty to arbitrary social lines. On a night thick with the heavy humidity of approaching storms, the unseen assailant breached another property, moving with impossible, barefoot silence across the damp earth. This time, he forced his way into the small room shared by Clara Strand and Christine Martenson. These two women were young, hopeful, and incredibly ambitious immigrants who had traveled from the distant shores of Sweden, seeking employment in the booming Texas capital. Like Molly Smith before them, they were hardworking domestic servants, relegated strictly to the same vulnerable architectural isolation that defined the working class. They lay sleeping in absolute darkness when the explosive violence erupted within the narrow confines of their quarters. The assault on the two Swedish women was a chaotic maelstrom of blunt force in the pitch black. The killer struck with terrifying speed and ferocity, bringing heavy, brutal, and completely improvised weaponry down upon them as they lay utterly defenseless. By an incredibly narrow margin, a combination of sheer luck and panicked resistance, both Clara and Christine managed to survive the harrowing ordeal. Their physical wounds were grievous, but their survival was a miraculous anomaly in a narrative defined by fatality. However, their survival did absolutely nothing to quell the rising tide of panic surging through Austin. It multiplied the sheer terror exponentially across every single neighborhood. The realization that the Phantom was actively targeting white, foreign-born women erased any lingering illusions of localized safety. The geography of fear expanded overnight. It became horrifyingly clear that the killer was not motivated by personal grievance or racial animus, but was driven by a voracious appetite for vulnerable women isolated in the dark. The immigrant communities were plunged into paranoia, realizing their humble quarters were mere targets for a predator who hunted without prejudice. As spring deepened into the sweltering heat of May, the violence mutated, abandoning chaotic frenzy and returning to the calculated butchery that defined his first strike. The date was the 6th of May, a night that would etch itself permanently into the darkest corners of Austin's history. The victim was Eliza Shelley, a hardworking mother who lived in a small auxiliary cabin on the property of her employers. She was a woman whose entire existence was defined by her fierce dedication to providing for her family, enduring grueling daily labor simply to maintain the pristine domestic lives of the upper class. On this night, the atmosphere was suffocatingly still. Eliza lay sleeping in her modest bed, entirely unaware of the silent horror gliding across the manicured lawns toward her frail door. But the truly devastating element of this tragedy was not merely the isolation of the victim. It was the presence of an innocent audience. Sleeping mere feet away from Eliza, breathing softly in the quiet dark, were her two precious, deeply vulnerable young children. The predator entered the cabin without making a single sound, his bare feet leaving no trace on the wooden floorboards. He stood over the sleeping mother, gripping a heavy, rusted axe retrieved from the yard. The sheer savagery of what followed defies rational comprehension. With a terrifying exertion of force, the killer brought the heavy iron blade crashing down upon Eliza Shelley. The blow was so incredibly violent, delivered with such unrestrained hatred, that it nearly decapitated her instantly. The sound of the horrific impact and the catastrophic end of their mother's life violently awakened the two small children. They were thrust from the peaceful realm of sleep directly into a waking nightmare. The absolute darkness of the room was punctuated only by the horrifying sounds of the killer forcefully dragging their mother's mutilated body away from the bed. They lay frozen, paralyzed by terror, listening to the heavy sounds of the Phantom hauling the remains of their protector out into the suffocating Texas night. The psychological devastation inflicted upon those children, left absolutely and completely alone in a room slick with their mother's blood, represents a profound depth of cruelty that shook the foundation of the city's collective soul. The city had barely begun to process the sickening reality of Eliza Shelley's murder when the Phantom struck again, a mere 17 days later, proving his thirst for violence was accelerating. On the 23rd of May, the heavy blanket of the night fell over the residence where Irene Cross resided. The pattern remained chillingly consistent. The isolation of the servant quarters, the total darkness, the stealthy approach. But this time, The killer altered his chosen instrument of destruction, exchanging the crushing weight of the axe for the intimate cruelty of a sharp dagger. Irene Cross was violently ambushed by the intruder, subjected to a frenzied series of deep, penetrating stab wounds that drained her life with terrifying speed. Yet, the physical act of murder was only the precursor to a far more disturbing psychological ritual. After extinguishing her life, the killer dragged her lifeless form out into the exposed dirt of the yard. There, in a gruesome display of domination, he meticulously utilized his blade to partially scalp the victim. He methodically removed a section of her hair and skin, a horrifying signature that spoke of a deep hatred and a pathological need to utterly defile his prey. The sweltering, stagnant heat of the Texas summer settled over Austin like a suffocating shroud, mirroring the inescapable dread that now choked every household. The city was bleeding, traumatized by the relentless succession of mutilated women, but the true nadir of human depravity, the absolute rock bottom of this nightmarish sequence, was yet to arrive. It came in the humid, suffocating month of August, and it arrived in a form so utterly vile that it shattered whatever fragile remaining sanity the community possessed. The Phantom, having exhausted his dark fascinations with adult women of varying backgrounds, turned his hollow, terrifying gaze upon the most vulnerable, defenseless demographic imaginable. His target was a child. Mary Ramey was merely 11 years old, a young girl whose life had barely begun to unfold before it was violently intercepted by the monster lurking in the shadows. She possessed the innocence of youth, entirely ignorant of the profound depths of evil that men were capable of inflicting. The invasion of Mary Ramey's sanctuary was an act of unspeakable cowardice and absolute moral bankruptcy. The Phantom slipped into the room where the young girl lay sleeping safely in her bed. He did not strike immediately as he had done with the others. Instead, he forcefully abducted the terrified child, ripping her from the only security she knew, and dragged her small, struggling body away from the buildings and out into a desolate stretch of barren land hidden by the oppressive night. Out there, in the profound isolation of the dirt and the weeds, away from any possibility of rescue, the child was subjected to an ordeal of unimaginable torment. The killer brutally sexually assaulted the 11-year-old girl, inflicting a trauma so severe it defies the boundaries of language. But the climax of his horrific ritual remained sickeningly consistent. After the assault, drawing upon the same dark psychological need that had driven him to violate Molly Smith months earlier, the predator located a rigid iron rod in the surrounding debris. With cold precision, he drove the metal spike violently through the young girl's ear, extinguishing her fragile life and pinning her to the earth in a final, terrifying display of grotesque possession. The discovery of Mary Ramey's desecrated body broke something fundamental within the city of Austin. It was no longer just fear. It was a profound, collective agony, a desperate realization that the entity hunting in their backyards possessed absolutely no humanity. As the long, agonizing summer of 1885 bled into the cooling, yet equally oppressive air of autumn, the city of Austin had become a place defined entirely by the absence of light and the omnipresence of death. Every corner of the city, from the grand, bustling boulevards of the business district to the quiet, dusty lanes of the residential outskirts, was suffused with an unspoken, paralyzing dread that dictated every human action. The Phantom was no longer merely a criminal threat. He had transcended that status to become a metaphysical presence, a dark force that had fundamentally altered the social fabric of the capital. The population, once defined by a burgeoning, optimistic pioneer spirit, now existed in a state of perpetual, high-alert psychological trauma. Parents kept their children bolted inside during the day and forbade any movement once the sun began its decline toward the horizon, while domestic workers, the primary targets of the killer's insatiable rage, lived in a state of absolute, existential terror. The small, wooden servant quarters, once accepted as a mundane necessity of architectural design, were now viewed as death traps, flimsy wooden cages that offered zero protection against the monster who moved through the night as if he were a part of the darkness itself. The authorities, despite their desperate attempts to maintain an image of competence and control, were completely and utterly out of their depth. They were hunters tracking a wolf, only to realize they were being stalked by a shapeless shadow that left nothing behind but destruction. The investigation had become a chaotic, sprawling mess of conflicting testimonies, unverified tips, and a growing, desperate paranoia that began to infect the department itself. Police Chief John A. Gamble, a man whose public reputation was crumbling as quickly as the city's peace, found himself at the center of an ever-widening circle of failure. The department had exhausted every conventional avenue of inquiry, and the frustration was beginning to manifest in increasingly draconian and unethical ways. The law enforcement strategy shifted from professional investigative work to a crude, blunt force display of power intended more to soothe the terrified public than to actually capture the killer. They turned their suspicion inward, toward the very communities that were being slaughtered. The patrols became more aggressive, more targeted, and more inherently biased. Any man of color who dared to be seen moving through the city streets after the mandated curfew was immediately subject to intense, often violent, interrogation and incarceration. This policy of profiling and intimidation served only to deepen the trauma of the African American community, who now faced the dual threat of a vicious, unknown murderer and a police force that viewed their very existence with suspicion. As the months dragged on toward the anniversary of the first murder, the psychological atmosphere of Austin reached a fever pitch of desperation. The citizens were beginning to lose faith in the ability of the legal system to protect them, leading to the rapid proliferation of local, grassroots vigilante justice. Private citizens, armed with rifles, shotguns, and primitive homemade weaponry, formed volunteer patrols that prowled the city's backyards and alleys from dusk until dawn. This was not a refined or organized civic duty. It was a volatile, combustible mix of genuine fear, deep-seated racial resentment, and the manic energy of a population that felt abandoned by the state. These informal militias frequently clashed with the official police patrols, creating a dangerous and confused environment where any shadow or unexpected movement could result in a hail of gunfire. The city was on the edge of a total breakdown of law and order, as the boundaries between the hunter and the hunted, the protector and the predator, became increasingly blurred. It was an environment that perfectly suited the Phantom, as the chaos and confusion created by the panicking populace provided him with even more effective cover to move, select, and strike. The intensity of the terror reached its absolute, devastating zenith on December 24, 1885. Exactly 1 year after the brutal slaughter of Molly Smith, the city found itself trapped in the same biting, damp chill of a Christmas Eve that had marked the beginning of their year-long nightmare. The population was on the verge of exhaustion, their nerves frayed, and their collective spirit broken by the relentless, unanswered violence that had claimed the lives of so many. On this particular night, the Phantom decided to orchestrate a performance of malice that would dwarf all of his previous atrocities in terms of sheer audacity and symbolic power. He struck twice in a single, devastating night, demonstrating an utter contempt for the efforts of the police, the vigilante patrols, and the newfound, desperate caution of the citizenry. The targets this time were not the marginalized workers in the servant quarters, but two women of high social standing, Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips. These women were pillars of the white upper class, living in homes that were considered impenetrable, protected by both their status and their wealth. The fact that the killer could breach these fortresses, silence these women, and subject them to his sadistic rituals proved, beyond any doubt, that no one was safe. The double murder that occurred on that fateful Christmas Eve served as a brutal, final indictment of the city's failed efforts. Susan Hancock was discovered in the cold, unyielding aftermath of the attack, her life extinguished with the same chilling efficiency that had characterized the killer's work since the start. She had been dragged out into the dark, exposed space of her backyard, the site of her final, terrifying moments. Nearby, the same grim fate had befallen Eula Phillips. The sight of these two women, lying in the frozen, blood-stained earth, sent a shockwave of realization through the elite circles of Austin. For the first time, The true, unrestricted nature of the monster's capabilities was fully acknowledged. He did not care about the status, the wealth, or the race of his victims. He only cared about the act of annihilation. The psychological barrier that had comforted the wealthy, the belief that they were somehow separated from the danger by their social position, was permanently shattered. The reality was naked and undeniable. The Phantom was an apex predator who could enter any home in Austin, regardless of its walls or its locks, and take exactly what he wanted. The horror of that final night also brought with it a profound sense of hopelessness. The police, despite their massive efforts, their hired private detectives from the prestigious and famously capable Pinkerton Agency, and their implementation of near-martial law, had failed to stop the killing. The city's investment in a technologically advanced answer to the darkness, the construction of massive, state-of-the-art moonlight towers intended to flood the city with intense, artificial light, was beginning to seem like a desperate, futile gesture against a shadow that thrived in the mind just as much as in the physical landscape. The citizens, watching the massive, glowing halos of the towers rise against the night, were gripped by the realization that light alone could not banish a monster of this magnitude. The atmosphere in Austin after the Christmas Eve murders was one of profound, suffocating mourning, mixed with an intense, burning rage that had no target to unleash itself upon. The city was a wounded animal, bleeding from 1,000 cuts, unable to identify the hand that held the blade. As the dust settled on those final, horrific crimes, a strange, eerie silence began to envelop the city. The Phantom, having achieved his final, definitive act of terror, simply ceased his operations. He did not stumble, he did not leave a clue, and he did not make the fatal error that the authorities had been praying for since the beginning. He simply vanished. The sudden cessation of the violence, after a year of continuous, escalating butchery, was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire saga. It left the residents of Austin in a state of perpetual, suspended animation, waiting for the next strike that never came. The psychological toll of this uncertainty was immense, as it prevented the city from ever truly moving past the trauma. They lived in a world where the monster had not been caught, but had merely gone dormant, leaving the community to wonder if he was still out there, hiding in plain sight, watching them from the very shadows that they were now frantically trying to illuminate with their electrical towers. This was the final, lasting victory of the servant girl annihilator. He didn't just kill his victims, he successfully poisoned the psyche of an entire city, leaving them to wonder, for decades to come, if the devil had truly left, or if he was simply waiting for the lights to go out once more. The aftermath of the final, shattering violence on Christmas Eve, 1885, left the city of Austin in a state of profound, jagged paralysis. While the physical acts of butchery had ceased, the psychological carnage remained, manifesting in a frantic, desperate, and often misguided effort by the authorities to provide a narrative of justice to a terrified public. Law enforcement, having failed to protect the populace during the height of the killing spree, now faced the crushing weight of public scrutiny and the humiliating reality of an unsolved, systemic failure. With no tangible suspect, no forensic evidence, and the Phantom having seemingly dissolved into the very mist of the Texas night, the police and the various private investigative bodies hired to assist them fell into a pattern of reactionary, desperate grasping. The investigative process, which should have been a cold, methodical exercise in deduction, instead devolved into a chaotic search for any individual who could be forcibly fitted into the profile of the monster. This led to a series of investigations that were marred by deep-seated prejudices, systemic incompetence, and a willingness to compromise the very foundations of the justice system in exchange for the appearance of resolution. The primary strategy of the authorities during these months of intense, post-crime scrutiny was the casting of a wide and indiscriminate net. They interrogated, detained, and surveilled dozens of men, particularly those from the marginalized communities who were already disproportionately targeted by the police. The interrogation rooms of the Austin precinct became sites of intense psychological and often physical pressure, where investigators, under immense pressure to provide a culprit, exerted enormous influence over suspects who had little access to legal recourse. The investigators often relied on the flimsy testimony of shaky witnesses, the coerced statements of individuals facing extreme duress, and the speculative, often circular, logic of individuals who were attempting to interpret the phantom's motivations through the narrow lens of their own biases. The result was a long, painful sequence of false leads and ruined reputations, where men were held for weeks or months based on nothing more than their proximity to a scene or a general, ill-defined suspicion of their character. This period of investigation serves as a stark, cautionary tale of what occurs when the desire for institutional stability and public perception overrides the fundamental mandate of objective discovery. One of the most notable, yet ultimately inconclusive, avenues of the investigation involved the scrutiny of the husbands and partners of the victims, particularly after the murders of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips. The fact that the killer had breached the inner sanctums of wealthy, white households led some investigators to the cynical conclusion that these murders must have been orchestrated, or at least facilitated, from within. They speculated that the husbands had used the widespread, chaotic myth of the phantom to mask their own acts of domestic violence, intending to frame an elusive, supernatural-seeming killer for crimes that were, in reality, driven by greed, jealousy, or simple, brutal malice. These men were subjected to grueling, prolonged interrogations that sought to uncover inconsistencies in their accounts, their financial motivations, or their potential for hidden, violent outbursts. Every facet of their private lives was laid bare. Their marriages were dissected, and their reputations were dragged through the mud of public suspicion. Yet, in every instance, the investigations reached an impasse. There was no physical evidence to link them to the specific, ritualistic nature of the murders, nor was there any logical explanation for how they could have successfully replicated the signature style of the phantom across such a vast time frame and a variety of different locations. The authorities were forced to release them, yet the stain of suspicion remained, a testament to the corrosive effect that the phantom's reign had on the social trust of the community. As the investigations deepened, the role of the Pinkerton detectives, who had been brought in to provide a professional, detached, and highly experienced perspective, became a point of significant contention. Their arrival in Austin had been met with a wave of hope, as the public viewed these legendary investigators as the final, desperate chance for salvation. However, the Pinkertons were faced with the same impossible landscape as the local police, a crime scene that had been compromised by months of public fear, a lack of credible physical leads, and a killer who functioned with almost zero friction in the environment. The detectives spent months mapping the city, analyzing the patterns of the attacks, and attempting to establish a motive, but their efforts were ultimately hamstrung by the same absence of concrete evidence that plagued the local force. They too became entangled in the web of suspicion, chasing shadows through the city's backyards and engaging in fruitless efforts to link the murders to transient criminal elements or nomadic laborers. The failure of the Pinkertons to provide a resolution was a significant blow to the city's collective confidence, signaling to the citizenry that there was no outside force or expert intelligence capable of neutralizing the danger. The logistical challenge of the investigation was further complicated by the sheer, uncoordinated nature of the city's response. The lack of a centralized, modern database of information meant that reports were lost, witnesses were misidentified, and valuable time was wasted as different investigative teams pursued the same fruitless leads. In the absence of a professional, unified strategy, the investigation became a fragmented, disjointed process where different authorities worked at cross purposes, often withholding information from one another in a quest for individual glory or institutional credit. This lack of cohesion was not merely an administrative issue, it was a fundamental failing that allowed the killer, whoever or whatever he may have been, to operate with impunity. It was an environment where the absence of a system allowed a monster to thrive, and the belated attempt to retroactively apply investigative rigor to the case only served to highlight the depths of the city's original, catastrophic unpreparedness. Perhaps the most significant, yet intangible, aspect of the investigative effort was the persistent, nagging doubt that remained in the minds of the investigators themselves. Long after the formal inquiries had concluded and the files had been archived, those who had been tasked with the capture of the Phantom continued to struggle with the impossibility of their mission. They had come face to face with an entity that did not adhere to the standard laws of human conflict or criminal motivation. They had interviewed witnesses who had seen nothing, collected evidence that offered no path forward, and spent countless, sleepless nights trying to reconcile the clinical precision of the murders with the chaotic, impulsive nature of the city's environment. This lingering, deep-seated sense of failure became a part of the city's lore, passed down through generations of law enforcement officers who would eventually look back at the case files as a reminder of the limits of human understanding. The investigation was not merely an effort to find a killer. It was an attempt to regain a sense of mastery over their own reality, an attempt that was ultimately and devastatingly denied. As time progressed and the immediate, acute pressure of the killings faded into the background, the investigative efforts evolved into a historical, rather than a practical, pursuit. The files, once the center of intense, feverish focus, began to collect dust, their contents gradually losing their urgency while retaining their capacity to disturb. The investigators who had once been the vanguard of the city's survival became the keepers of its darkest secrets. They understood, perhaps better than anyone else, that they had not arrived at a conclusion, but had simply stopped searching. They had been forced to acknowledge that the Phantom had won, not through superior strategy, but through his ability to manipulate the fundamental weaknesses of the society he hunted. He had demonstrated that justice, in the face of such absolute, unreasoning evil, is not a guarantee, but a privilege, and that when a city is fundamentally divided, fearful, and unprepared, it leaves itself vulnerable to being torn apart from the inside out by forces it cannot comprehend. The conclusion of the investigative phase was not a moment of closure, but a somber acceptance that the mystery of the servant girl annihilator would remain, for the foreseeable future, an unreachable, terrifying monument to the fragility of order in the heart of the Texas frontier. The culmination of this harrowing saga did not arrive with a dramatic arrest or a courtroom confession. Instead, it arrived with a sudden, eerie silence that was as absolute as it was unsatisfying. For over a year, the Phantom had held the city of Austin in a suffocating grip, a reign of terror punctuated by the systematic, ritualistic slaughter of innocent women. When the violence abruptly ceased in the aftermath of that final, double murder on Christmas Eve, the city was left not with justice, but with a profound, gaping wound that refused to heal. The lack of a definitive legal conclusion, no trial, no verdict, no public accounting, left a vacuum that was quickly filled by rumor, speculation, and a desperate, agonizing search for meaning. In the absence of a trial, the citizenry was forced to turn to the only mechanism they had left for reconciling with the past, the mythology of the monster. The city became a place where the memory of the victims was permanently intertwined with the legend of their killer, and the legal system, once relied upon as the ultimate arbiter of truth, found itself sidelined in the face of an enduring, impossible mystery. One of the most persistent threads of this collective search for a culprit revolved around the fate of Nathan Elgin, a young man whose life was tragically and violently ended in February of 1886, only weeks after the final murders. Elgin was a young African-American man working as a butcher's assistant, a position that, in the eyes of a traumatized and prejudiced public, immediately linked him to the instruments of the Phantom's crimes. When Elgin, intoxicated and involved in a desperate, criminal act of abduction, was gunned down by police in a chaotic confrontation, the city immediately and collectively seized upon his death as the definitive end to the nightmare. The logic was simple, comfortingly circular, and entirely devoid of nuance. The killings had stopped, and Elgin was dead. Therefore, Elgin must have been the killer. For a populace that had been living in a state of absolute, existential terror for 15 months, this narrative provided the one thing the legal system had failed to deliver: a sense of closure. It allowed them to close the books on the trauma, to stop looking over their shoulders, and to return to a semblance of a normal, albeit forever scarred, existence. Yet, this conclusion was never formal, never tested in a court of law, and never verified by a confession or a discovery of evidence. There was never an inquiry that sought to establish a timeline of Elgin's movements, an analysis of his potential psychological motivations, or a forensic examination of his actions in relation to the specific, ritualistic signatures of the murders. It was a narrative of convenience, a desperate social construction intended to restore order to a shattered community. Even as the years stretched into decades, those with a closer look at the investigation knew that the case against Elgin was built on little more than his occupation and his race. There was no direct evidence, no witnesses who had seen him at any of the scenes, and no items recovered from his possession that could be definitively linked to the victims. The reliance on his death as the solution was a reflection of the systemic failures of the period, a willingness to trade the rigorous pursuit of truth for the immediate psychological relief of a scapegoat. The story of Nathan Elgin became a cautionary ghost story, a reminder of the dangers of institutional bias and the human tendency to project guilt onto the most vulnerable when faced with an uncontrollable threat. The lack of a formal trial meant that the victims were never afforded the public recognition of their suffering that the legal process typically provides. There was no opportunity for the families to stand in a court of law and witness the prosecution of a perpetrator, no opportunity for the community to confront the individual responsible for their collective pain. The legal aftermath was defined by a series of quiet, unresolved endings. Files were shuttered, records were filed away, and the formal police efforts transitioned into a passive state of maintenance. The city, in its rush to move forward, effectively buried the tragedy alongside the victims. The absence of a trial left the victims as tragic, abstract figures in a larger story, their individual humanity often overshadowed by the overwhelming, dark allure of the phantom who took their lives. It was an institutionalized forgetting, a quiet erasure that allowed the city to proceed with its ambitions while leaving the unresolved trauma of the killings to fester in the background, a silent, persistent presence in the city's development. The frustration surrounding the lack of a trial was compounded by the fact that the legal system had been so visibly and humiliatingly compromised by the investigation. The frequent, unproven arrests and the intense, targeted harassment of marginalized groups had created a deep, lasting rift in the community. The law, which should have been a source of security, was remembered by many as an engine of chaos and oppression during the months of the killings. This failure to arrive at a legal conclusion meant that there was never any reckoning with these systemic abuses of power. The police department, having failed in its primary duty, was never forced to modernize its methods or address its inherent biases in a transparent, public setting. The legacy of the investigations was a legacy of cynicism, a recognition that the legal system was deeply fallible, easily manipulated by fear, and fundamentally inadequate when faced with the truly unprecedented. This cynicism would persist long after the phantom was gone, influencing the way in which the community interacted with their local authorities for generations. The only remaining form of trial took place in the court of public opinion, a chaotic and fragmented space where the theories multiplied in inverse proportion to the facts. The debate over who the phantom really was became a permanent feature of the city's discourse. Was he a lone, deranged individual with a background in butchery? Was he a transient, sophisticated predator who had successfully blended into the societal structures of the wealthy? Was he a product of the very social divisions that the city had tried so hard to build, a monster born from the friction of extreme inequality? These questions, debated in bars, in private homes, and in the columns of the local newspapers, served as a surrogate for the trial that never happened. They were an attempt to maintain a connection to the truth, to keep the memory of the tragedy alive even as the city aggressively tried to rebuild itself. Yet, the fact that these questions were still being asked 140 years later serves as the ultimate indictment of the justice system's failure in the 1880s. It confirms that the legal system, in its desperation for a convenient, quiet ending, had failed to provide the one thing the community needed most: the truth. In the final assessment, the absence of a trial was perhaps the most enduring, if invisible, victim of the servant girl annihilator. By denying the city the closure of a public, legal resolution, the phantom had ensured that the tragedy would remain an open wound. He had successfully prevented the legal process from ever functioning, from ever asserting the power of the state over the individual, or from providing a sense of moral finality to the horrific events. The city of Austin was forced to live with the reality that they had been successfully preyed upon by an entity they could not understand, investigate, or punish. They were forced to accept the uncomfortable, persistent truth that there are some shadows that no amount of artificial light can ever truly illuminate, and that sometimes the most profound evils are the ones that are never brought to account. The legacy of the servant girl annihilator was, therefore, not just the loss of life, but the enduring realization of the limitations of justice itself, a realization that continues to haunt the history of the Texas Capitol to this day. The legacy of the servant girl annihilator is not merely a historical footnote in the annals of American crime. It is an enduring, spectral presence that continues to shape the consciousness of Austin, serving as a chilling reminder of how quickly the foundations of a society can be unmade by the presence of an unknown evil. For over a century, the Phantom has occupied a singular, elevated position in the mythology of the Texas frontier, acting as a grim mirror in which the city examines its own growth, its prejudices, and its fundamental vulnerabilities. The long-term consequences of this year of terror extend far beyond the immediate trauma of the murders, rippling outward into the architectural, psychological, and sociological development of the city. The most iconic manifestation of this, of course, is the city's reliance on the Moonlight Towers. These towering, electrically illuminated structures, initially conceived as a desperate, utilitarian response to an unseen hunter, have evolved into a quintessential, almost romanticized, symbol of Austin's identity. They stand as a silent, glowing testament to the era when the city attempted to technologically engineer its own safety against the encroaching darkness, an attempt that, while scientifically innovative, was ultimately a psychological reaction to the absolute power of the predator. The psychological scars left upon the community by the Phantom's reign were deeply embedded, influencing the way subsequent generations interacted with their environment, their neighbors, and the very concept of safety. For decades, the collective memory of the murders fostered a culture of extreme, hypervigilant caution, where the fear of the dark was not merely a childhood trope but a rationalized, adult reality. The stories of the servant girl annihilator, passed down as cautionary tales through families and neighborhoods, reinforced the social boundaries that the killer had originally exploited. They became a part of the city's folklore, a dark, pulsing undercurrent beneath the surface of the city's rapid modernization. The trauma ensured that the city's development was characterized by a certain underlying anxiety, a sense that progress, while impressive, was always fragile and susceptible to disruption. This anxiety became woven into the city's narrative, subtly tempering its optimism with a profound, well-earned skepticism about the reliability of institutions to provide absolute protection. Sociologically, the Phantom's reign accelerated and intensified the divisions that already existed within the city. The investigations, with their biased focus on marginalized communities and the systemic failures to protect those in the servant quarters, laid bare the stark inequality of the Texas Capitol. The memory of how the legal system functioned during the crisis, as a mechanism for policing the poor rather than protecting them, persisted, fueling long-term distrust in authority that would inform the city's internal political and social dynamics for generations. The servant girl annihilator did not create these divisions, but he exploited them with ruthless efficiency, forcing the city to confront the reality that its protective structures were never designed to be universal. The failure to reconcile with the victims, to treat their lives as having equal value, regardless of their social, racial, or economic position, remained a silent, haunting deficiency in the city's moral narrative, a testament to the work that remained to be done long after the killings had stopped. The persistent, historical fascination with the identity of the Phantom, whether he was the butcher Nathan Elgin, a transient nomad who moved on to London, or a local figure of high status and hidden depravity, speaks to the enduring power of the mystery itself. The lack of a definitive answer allows the entity to remain a shapeless, adaptive figure, a projection of whatever current fears or anxieties the community happens to be harboring. This inability to definitively close the case has turned the Phantom into a literary, almost archetypal, figure. He is the ultimate intruder, the personification of the idea that safety is an illusion and that there are forces that can enter our most private, protected spaces and shatter our existence without warning or reason. This archetypal quality ensures that the story remains evergreen, continually analyzed by criminalists, historians, and authors who are drawn to the case precisely because of its stubborn resistance to resolution. It serves as a reminder that the most potent stories are often the ones that refuse to provide us with the comfort of a clear ending. Reflecting upon the entire saga, one is struck by the crushing weight of the silence that followed the violence. The Phantom, by ending his campaign as suddenly as he had begun it, managed to rob the city of the finality it so desperately craved. He effectively ensured that his crimes would not just be remembered as a series of events, but as a perpetual, open-ended question. In this, he was truly successful in his path of annihilation. He annihilated not just the lives of his victims, but the possibility of a clean, historical conclusion. The memory of the servant girl annihilator serves as a solemn, somber reflection on the limitations of human knowledge and the fragility of the order we construct to shield ourselves from the chaos of the world. It compels us to recognize that the darkness he thrived in was not just a physical absence of light, but a psychological one, an absence of empathy, an absence of justice, and an absence of the unity required to protect the most vulnerable among us. In the final analysis, the story of the servant girl annihilator is not simply a tale of a murderer, but a tale of a city forced to confront its own shadow. Austin, in its struggle to define itself as a modern, progressive capital, was forced to contend with the reality that it had fostered an environment where such a monster could flourish. The lessons of the case are multifaceted and sobering. They teach us about the dangers of institutional negligence, the corrosive nature of systemic bias, and the profound, long-lasting impact of unaddressed trauma. They underscore the reality that the pursuit of truth is an active, ongoing responsibility, not something that can be abandoned simply because it becomes inconvenient or difficult. The ghost of the Phantom still stalks the collective memory of the city, not as a literal presence, but as a symbolic reminder of the cost of indifference. Ultimately, the tragedy of the servant girl annihilator serves as a timeless, harrowing meditation on the nature of evil and the struggle to maintain one's humanity in its presence. The Phantom was a force of entropy, a chaos agent that tested the limits of what a community could withstand. His enduring legacy is the collective, ongoing realization that the work of building a just and secure society is never finished. It requires a constant, vigilance-filled engagement with the very institutions and structures that we rely upon for protection. The memory of the women who were so brutally and senselessly silenced serves as the anchor for this reflection, ensuring that their names and their stories are not entirely lost to the fog of history. They represent the human cost of the mystery, the tangible, irreplaceable lives that were sacrificed on the altar of a dark, inexplicable obsession. As long as we continue to study, to discuss, and to mourn the events of 1884 and 1885, we acknowledge that their lives mattered, and we ensure that their stories remain a barrier against the encroaching darkness. The Phantom may have vanished into the annals of history, but the profound, resonant impact of his presence remains, woven into the very fabric of the city he once hunted. He stands as a dark, cautionary icon in the American true crime tradition, a testament to the terrifying reality that beneath the veneer of civilization, there always exists a space where the shadows grow long, silent, and potentially lethal, waiting for the next opportunity to assert themselves against the light. To contemplate the absolute, chilling finality of the 1884 and 1885 murder spree is to confront the terrifying reality that justice is not an inevitable conclusion, but a fragile construction that can easily be dismantled by the presence of a truly disciplined predator. As we look back across the chasm of more than a century, the Phantom's reign of terror remains an isolated monument to the failure of the state to shield its most vulnerable citizens. The victims of this butcher were not merely casualties of a criminal investigation that went awry. They were casualties of a social and political order that effectively rendered them invisible until the moment their lives were violently extinguished. The persistent, gnawing sense of unease that accompanies the study of this case arises from the realization that the killer did not possess any supernatural abilities. He simply possessed a cold, terrifying understanding of how to exploit the cracks in the armor of a society that was so preoccupied with its own growth and institutional vanity that it neglected to see the shadow creeping through its own backyards. The annihilation of these women was facilitated by the very structure of the city they served, a structure that prioritized the comfort and security of the few at the direct expense of the many, leaving behind a legacy of institutional remorse that remains largely unacknowledged. The historical memory of these events has been shaped by a persistent, almost morbid curiosity that often masks the deeper, more uncomfortable questions of accountability and systemic failure. We are drawn to the gore, to the bizarre, ritualistic details of the iron spikes and the discarded axes, because these details provide a tangible, if grotesque, form to a monster that otherwise remains a terrifying abstraction. Yet, by focusing so intensely on the mechanics of the violence, we risk marginalizing the humanity of the individuals who were stolen from the world. Molly Smith, Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, Mary Ramey, and all those whose names and faces have been eroded by time. They were not mere background characters in a thrilling narrative of Victorian-era mystery. They were mothers, workers, dreamers, and human beings whose lives were brutally, definitively intercepted. Their erasure from the collective consciousness, their transformation into a dark fable, is perhaps the ultimate manifestation of the same societal neglect that allowed their killer to operate with such impunity in the first place. Reclaiming their humanity from the weight of the legend is perhaps the only true form of justice available to us, a task that requires us to shift our gaze from the phantom to the people he destroyed. The narrative of the Phantom's disappearance is a testament to the fact that evil, when left unchecked by a robust and equitable system of justice, does not necessarily need to be caught in order to succeed. It only needs to wait for the world to move on. The silence that fell over Austin after the Christmas Eve murders of 1885 was not a silence born of resolution, but a silence born of exhaustion and the desperate, primal urge to forget. The city, in its rush to shed the skin of its trauma, effectively buried the evidence of its own vulnerabilities. It prioritized the restoration of its reputation as a safe, thriving center of progress over the hard, agonizing work of uncovering the truth and addressing the underlying rot that had permitted such a sustained campaign of violence. This choice, while understandable in the heat of the moment, created a historical precedent where the tragedy was relegated to the status of an anomaly, a strange, dark interlude that had no lasting impact on the city's identity or its responsibilities to its citizens. This refusal to fully own the history of the servant girl annihilator has resulted in a fragmented understanding of the event, one that continues to obscure the systemic lessons that remain relevant to our modern discussions of crime, class, and the nature of public safety. In the contemporary study of this case, we are forced to grapple with the limitations of our own analytical tools as we attempt to apply the sophisticated, modern techniques of behavioral profiling and criminal psychology to an environment that was fundamentally ill-equipped to understand the phenomenon of the serial predator. The Phantom represents a bridge between the archaic, frontier-style violence of the 19th century and the modern, clinical, and often motivated by psychological aberration violence of the 20th and 21st centuries. He stands at the threshold of our understanding of what it means to be a monster, occupying a space that is both ancient in its cruelty and chillingly modern in its anonymity and lack of discernible motive. The ongoing efforts to categorize him, to name him, and to fit him into the established canon of criminal history speak to our own deep-seated need for order, our desire to believe that if we can only find the right label, the right motive, or the right name, we can somehow strip him of his power to terrify. But the Phantom resists these efforts, remaining a stubborn, persistent void that reminds us of the limits of our own intelligence and the inherent unpredictability of the human capacity for darkness. The enduring impact of the case also serves as a somber reflection on the role of the press and the public imagination in the construction of criminal legends. During the late 19th century, the The sensationalist reporting of the Austin newspapers played an indispensable role in transforming the Phantom from a murderer into a myth, amplifying the terror while simultaneously obscuring the factual reality of the crimes. The public's insatiable appetite for these narratives, combined with the authorities' willingness to manipulate the media in an attempt to project strength, created a feedback loop of fear and rumor that made a rational, objective investigation impossible. This dynamic, while rooted in the specific technological and social context of the 1880s, is a phenomenon that we recognize all too clearly today. The way we consume and participate in the mythology of the serial killer, the way we transform real, lived trauma into content for our own entertainment, is a continuation of the same psychological processes that allowed the legend of the servant girl annihilator to bloom in the first place. We are, in a very real sense, the heirs to that 19th century impulse to engage with the darkness from a distance, and the study of this case offers us a rare, uncomfortable opportunity to examine the ethical implications of our own obsession. As we bring this reflection to its conclusion, we are left with the persistent, lingering image of the Moonlight Towers, those towering, electrically charged monuments to an era of profound, desperate ambition and paralyzing fear. They stand as a silent, visible reminder of the moment when the city attempted to technologically conquer the night, a mission that was fundamentally impossible because the darkness the Phantom inhabited was not a physical condition, but a psychological one. The servant girl annihilator was not conquered by the light. He simply waited until the fear became a part of the city's routine, and then he left behind a landscape that was permanently altered. The light that we project into the darkness can illuminate the physical obstacles in our path, but it can never truly banish the specter of what we are capable of inflicting upon one another when the social contract is allowed to fray. The story of this year of terror is ultimately a story about the fragility of our communal bond, a warning that the safety we take for granted is not a static state of being, but a dynamic, active process that requires our constant, unwavering commitment to the dignity and protection of every member of our society, particularly those who are most easily cast into the shadows. The final, silent witness to the atrocities of 1884 and 1885 remains the land itself, the soil of Austin that absorbed the blood of the victims and the silence of the Phantom. It is a landscape that has been transformed by progress, covered in concrete and glass, and bustling with the noise of a new, different century, yet it retains the imprint of the past in the way we conceptualize our own safety. Every time we walk through a city street that is brightly lit, every time we lock our doors with an automated system, and every time we instinctively look over our shoulder in the dark, we are, in a quiet and largely unconscious way, responding to the ghost of the servant girl annihilator. He has become a part of the city's subconscious, a permanent, cautionary footnote that warns us against the dangers of hubris and the lethal consequences of institutional failure. His identity may forever remain beyond our reach, his motives may continue to elude our analysis, and the specifics of his final end may remain locked in the vault of history, but his presence, as a challenge to our understanding of ourselves and the communities we build, remains as potent and as disturbing as ever. We are left with the final, sobering realization that the most dangerous ghosts are not the ones that haunt our houses, but the ones that haunt our history, reminding us of the depths to which we can sink and the long, exhausting, and necessary work of ensuring that we never return to the darkness of that year. The final chapter of this long, haunting narrative must necessarily return us to the silent, mud-soaked ground where the nightmare first took root, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable reality that some mysteries are not meant to be solved by the blunt instruments of human law, but are destined to exist forever as scars upon the collective psyche. The servant girl annihilator did not leave behind a neat, logical resolution that could satisfy the demands of a modern true crime audience, nor did he provide the closure that the traumatized families of his victims so desperately required. Instead, he left a void, a chilling, persistent absence that has allowed his legend to expand and mutate, filling the gaps in our historical record with the dark, imaginative architecture of our own deepest fears. To look back at the conclusion of this saga is to acknowledge that the pursuit of truth, while an essential component of the human experience, is frequently a futile endeavor when faced with an adversary who operates entirely outside the boundaries of societal norms and human empathy. The Phantom was the ultimate manifestation of the unpredictable, a force of entropy that demonstrated the terrifying fragility of the social order in a burgeoning, ambitious metropolis. As we attempt to synthesize the fragmented remains of this investigation, we are struck by the realization that our obsession with the identity of the killer, our endless debates regarding the butcher Nathan Elgin or the potential for a sophisticated, white-collar predator, is perhaps a defense mechanism against the far more unsettling possibility that the killer was nobody, or rather, that he could have been anybody. The terror of the Phantom is heightened precisely because he lacked a singular, definable profile, acting as a chameleon who moved seamlessly through the city, appearing as a domestic servant to some, a faceless laborer to others, and a phantom to all. This anonymity was his greatest weapon, turning every shadow, every quiet lane, and every darkened doorway into a potential site of execution. The lingering trauma of Austin was not just the result of the murders themselves, but the result of the realization that their city, their community, their very home, had been transformed into a hunting ground by an entity that they could not see, touch, or define. It is this persistent, undefined nature of the threat that ensures the case remains one of the most chilling and resonant entries in the history of American crime, as it forces us to grapple with the vulnerability inherent in our own existence. The study of this case provides us with a profound, sobering lesson on the nature of institutional memory and the way in which societies process their own history of trauma. The decision of Austin to move forward, to aggressively modernize, and to leave the unresolved questions of the 1880s in the rearview mirror was not a sign of resilience, but a sign of a society that was fundamentally unable to process its own pain. By failing to confront the systemic failures of the period, by failing to provide justice for the victims, and by failing to hold its leadership accountable, the city ensured that the trauma would be transmitted down through the generations, manifesting in the city's persistent, quiet anxiety and its cyclical fascination with the case. The servant girl annihilator is not just a monster of the 19th century, he is a permanent fixture in the city's consciousness, a ghost that serves as a reminder of the incomplete work of building a safe and equitable community. We do not study this case merely to understand the crimes. We study it to understand the way in which a society's failure to deal with its own darkness can leave it susceptible to the same shadows, time and time again. The resilience of the legend is also a testament to the fact that we, as a society, have a fundamental need to narrativize our fears. We turn the raw, unfiltered violence of the past into the structured, familiar tropes of true crime, hoping that by placing these events into the safe, contained containers of books, podcasts, and documentaries, we can somehow tame the terror they represent. But the servant girl annihilator refuses to be tamed, as his story always ends with the same, maddening lack of resolution. He remains a raw nerve, a challenge to our desire for order and our belief that history is a linear, progressive march toward enlightenment and justice. He is a dark, static figure who stands in defiance of our modern, confident analytical frameworks, a reminder that the world is often far more complex, irrational, and dangerous than we would like to believe. The ongoing public fascination with this case serves as a mirror for our own modern insecurities, reflecting our persistent fears about our safety, our privacy, and the adequacy of the institutions we rely on to protect us from the predators who move in the periphery of our lives. Looking beyond the specific context of Austin, the servant girl annihilator stands as a quintessential archetype in the American true crime tradition, representing the first, most brutal instance of the serial predator in the modern urban landscape. He set a precedent for the way in which we visualize and conceptualize the serial killer, emphasizing the elements of stealth, ritual, and the targeting of vulnerable populations that would become the hallmarks of subsequent, more famous cases. But unlike the killers who would follow him, those who would eventually be captured, tried, and documented in the clinical, cold light of the modern judicial system, the Phantom remains a pure, abstract agent of horror. He has been stripped of the humanizing or perhaps dehumanizing context of a courtroom, a diagnosis, or a life story. He is allowed to remain a monster in the truest sense of the word, a figure whose power to frighten is undiminished by the passing of time, because we are still unable to look him in the eye and say that we know who he was, or why he did what he did. The final word on this case is one of somber recognition, a bowing of the head to the lives that were so senselessly stolen and the silence that has surrounded their tragedy for nearly a century and a half. The servants of Austin were the invisible foundation of the city, and in their death, they revealed the deep, structural fractures that the city's leaders were so desperate to hide. To honor their memory is not to focus on the gore of their end, but to acknowledge the dignity and importance of their lives, and to commit ourselves to the ongoing, exhausting, and necessary work of ensuring that such a tragedy is never allowed to occur again. The phantom shadow may still stretch long across the city, but it is not a shadow that can overpower the light of our collective understanding and our commitment to justice. We are the stewards of their story, the ones tasked with ensuring that they are never truly forgotten and that the lessons of the 1880s are not lost in the fog of history. As we conclude this long journey through the dark corridors of Austin's past, we must acknowledge that while the Phantom remains a mystery, his legacy is not. His legacy is the enduring realization that the strength of a society is measured by its capacity to protect its most vulnerable members, and that when we fail in this, we invite the darkness into our own homes. The story of the servant girl annihilator is a heavy, essential weight that we carry with us, a reminder that we are all responsible for the safety of our neighbor, and that the shadows we fail to illuminate in our own time are the shadows that will eventually come to hunt us. May the memory of those who were lost serve as a permanent, vigilant barrier against the return of that dark, blood-stained winter, and may we continue to strive for a future where justice is not a luxury, but a fundamental, guaranteed reality for all. The Phantom may have slipped into the night, but the truth, as difficult and as elusive as it may be, remains our only, our strongest, and our final defense. The final echoes of this harrowing historical account do not merely fade into the quietude of archival records. They linger as a testament to the persistent, restless nature of unresolved trauma within the human spirit. To revisit the story of the servant girl annihilator is to acknowledge that the pursuit of historical truth is frequently a Sisyphean endeavor, a constant, uphill struggle against the eroding power of time, the deliberate omissions of the past, and the inherent limitations of our own collective perception. The city of Austin, in the aftermath of the 1884 and 1885 massacres, was forced to redefine its relationship with the darkness, transitioning from a state of naive optimism to a more nuanced, cynical, and guarded understanding of its own vulnerability. This transformation was not achieved through the triumph of justice, but through the hard, pragmatic necessity of survival. The Phantom, by systematically dismantling the safety of the servant quarters, had inadvertently forced the city to confront the structural inequalities that had long been ignored, exposing the reality that their grand civic ambitions were built upon a foundation of unrecognized and unprotected labor. The legacy of the murderer, therefore, is irrevocably tied to the socio-political evolution of the Texas capital, serving as a dark, cautionary catalyst that ensured the city would never again be the insulated, protected environment it once imagined itself to be. The enduring resonance of this case lies in its unique ability to disrupt our comfort with the past. We often look back at the 19th century through a filter of romanticized distance, viewing it as a simpler, more orderly time, yet the story of the Phantom shatters this illusion, revealing an age defined by the same chaotic, unpredictable, and lethal impulses that continue to plague our contemporary society. The brutality inflicted upon the victims was not a product of its time. It was a fundamental, primal manifestation of the human capacity for cruelty, unrestrained by the social and legal mechanisms we assume to be universal. By placing the servant girl annihilator within the context of our own modern understanding of the serial offender, we are forced to grapple with the uncomfortable realization that the monster is not an aberration of history, but a recurring possibility, a dark, dormant potential that exists within every community, awaiting the perfect storm of structural weakness, social division, and psychological instability to erupt. This realization is what maintains the case's chilling relevance. It serves as a bridge connecting the brutal, muddy realities of the Texas frontier to our own complex, illuminated, yet still deeply shadowed world. As we look toward the future, the lessons derived from this tragedy must be integrated into our broader understanding of social justice and public responsibility. The failures of the Austin authorities to effectively protect the marginalized, their willingness to scapegoat the vulnerable, and their ultimate abandonment of the investigative process are not merely historical errors. They are systemic failures that remain relevant to our ongoing discourse regarding the equitable application of the law. The victims of the Phantom deserve more than to be remembered as the initial subjects of a sensationalized, unsolved mystery. They deserve to be recognized as the catalysts for a critical, necessary self-examination of the society that failed to safeguard their lives. The work of uncovering the truth, of honoring their memory, and of ensuring that such a systemic abandonment never occurs again, is a continuous responsibility that demands our active, informed, and empathetic participation. We must be the ones who refuse to allow the shadow of the Phantom to continue to dictate the terms of our engagement with the past, insisting instead on a historical narrative that acknowledges the full weight of the loss and the deep, enduring importance of every single life. The mystery of the Phantom's identity, while undoubtedly the hook that draws so many to the case, should not distract us from the far more profound mystery of human resilience. How does a community survive such a sustained, intimate assault upon its peace? How do individuals move forward after witnessing the absolute destruction of their sanctuary? The story of Austin is not just a story of how a killer tore a city apart. It is a story of how a city, despite its profound flaws and its systemic failures, managed to endure and to rebuild itself in the shadow of such overwhelming darkness. The resilience of the survivors, the collective mourning of the community, and the persistent, quiet determination of those who refuse to let the names of the victims be entirely forgotten, these are the elements of the saga that hold the true, transformative power. They reflect the fundamental, stubborn human drive to seek light even in the face of an existential, unreasoning abyss, a drive that continues to define our existence and our struggle to maintain our humanity in the face of the unthinkable. We must also reflect on the way in which our own technological and scientific advancements influence our perspective on the past. The reliance on the Moonlight Towers as a beacon of hope in the 1880s is a poignant, if ultimately futile, attempt to solve a psychological problem with physical tools, a mistake that we continue to make today. We believe that if we have enough data, enough surveillance, and enough advanced, high-fidelity security, we can permanently banish the monster. Yet, the story of the Phantom reminds us that the darkness he thrived in was not just a lack of illumination, but a failure of empathy and a lack of social cohesion. We cannot secure our society through technology alone. We must secure it through the strength of our connections to one another, through our commitment to the well-being of the most vulnerable, and through our willingness to address the injustices that reside in the heart of our own cities. The light we need is not the light of the electric lamp, but the light of understanding, of shared responsibility, and of the unwavering belief that every life is an essential part of the whole. As this reflection draws to a close, we acknowledge that the servant girl annihilator remains a presence that is both absent and eternally present. He is a historical figure who has dissolved into the fog, yet he remains an active, shaping force in the history of the American West. He has become a part of the landscape, a piece of the identity of the Texas Capitol, and a permanent, haunting reference point for anyone who chooses to look into the shadows of the past. May we never grow comfortable with the silence that surrounds his crimes, and may we never lose the urgency with which we must pursue the truth, no matter how distant or how buried it may appear to be. The ghosts of the victims deserve our constant, vigilant memory, and the story of their end, as difficult as it is to confront, is an essential, necessary part of our own historical reckoning. We stand in the light of the present, looking back across the decades at a city that once struggled to survive the night, and in doing so, we recognize our own responsibility to ensure that the light we carry into the future is a light that includes everyone, leaving no one in the periphery, and allowing no shadow to grow strong enough to threaten our shared security once again. The saga of the 1880s, with its mixture of grand ambition and horrific, intimate violence, will forever stand as a testament to the fact that we are the authors of our own history, responsible for the stories we choose to preserve and the silences we choose to break. The Phantom may have been an agent of chaos, but we remain the stewards of order, the individuals tasked with navigating the complexities of our shared existence and ensuring that the dignity of the lost is never sacrificed to the convenience of the found. We carry this memory not as a burden, but as a commitment, a promise that we will remain watchful, that we will remain empathetic, and that we will never again allow the darkness of prejudice and neglect to flourish at the expense of our neighbors. The story of the servant girl annihilator ends here, not with a resolution, but with a lingering, persistent call to action, a call to remember, to understand, and to remain perpetually committed to the fundamental, sacred, and fragile task of protecting the light for one another across the darkness of all time. The finality of our exploration into the dark, labyrinthine history of the servant girl annihilator brings us to a profound, contemplative silence, a space where the noise of history fades and the weight of human experience remains. We have traversed the muddy, blood-stained paths of 1884 and 1885, looking into the eyes of a monster who effectively defined the limits of human understanding during the American frontier period. This journey has not been one of mere entertainment or the passive consumption of macabre trivia. It has been a rigorous, empathetic, and necessary engagement with the fragility of the societal contract. By examining the lives of those who are lost, the cook, the maid, the immigrant, the child, we have sought to reclaim their voices from the oppressive shadow of the unknown. We have learned that the true horror of the case does not lie in the visceral, mechanical details of the violence, but in the institutional apathy that allowed such atrocities to persist for 15 agonizing months. It is this realization that society is often complicit in the crimes of its monsters through its own neglect and its own narrow focus on the protection of the privileged that provides the most enduring, most painful lesson of the entire saga. As we step back from the history of Austin's dark year, we must confront the reality that we are not observers of a closed chapter, but participants in a continuing, evolving struggle to define safety and justice in our own time. The servant girl annihilator is not a relic of the past. He is a permanent, haunting archetype, a reminder that the shadows we fail to illuminate in our own communities are the shadows that will eventually harbor the threats we fear the most. The Phantom thrives on the distance we place between ourselves and the vulnerable, on the social structures that isolate the marginalized in the name of efficiency or comfort, and on the institutional biases that prevent us from recognizing the common humanity of all victims. By studying this case, we are not just analyzing a murder investigation. We are conducting a diagnostic assessment of our own societal health, testing the strength of our empathy, our commitment to objective truth, and our willingness to confront the uncomfortable realities of our own collective past. We are forced to ask ourselves, as we move through our own modernized, illuminated cities, whether we have truly progressed beyond the limitations of the 1880s, or if we have merely shifted the shadows to different, more subtle locations. The legacy of the victims is the most vital, most precious component of this historical record, and it is a legacy that we must guard with perpetual, vigilant care. They were the ones who paid the ultimate price for the city's failings, their lives cut short in a grotesque violation that defies the moral foundations of our world. To remember them is to honor their potential, their labor, their presence, and their humanity, ensuring that they are not permanently subsumed by the legend of the individual who took everything from them. We must insist on a historical narrative that centers their experiences, acknowledging the profound, lasting impact of their absence and the systemic injustices that contributed to their peril. This is the only path toward a meaningful, albeit incomplete, form of justice, a commitment to keep their stories alive as a barrier against the encroaching darkness of apathy and ignorance. Their names, their stories, and their tragedies must continue to function as a persistent, moral imperative, challenging us to be better, to be more inclusive, and to be more protective of the most vulnerable members of our society. In the final assessment, the story of the servant girl annihilator remains an open-ended, unfinished, and deeply troubling testament to the limits of our own knowledge and the enduring, unpredictable nature of evil. It is a story that refuses to be neatly filed away or comfortably summarized, continuing to pose the same unanswerable questions that it posed to the investigators of the 19th century. Why did he choose them? How did he move with such impossible, ghost-like silence? Why did he stop, and where did he go when the light finally became too bright for him to comfortably exist? These questions, while destined to remain forever unanswered, are not proof of our failure, but proof of the complexity of the human experience. They serve as a permanent reminder that there are aspects of the world that exist beyond our reach, and that the pursuit of truth is not always about arriving at a definitive, crystalline answer, but about the process of confronting the unknown with integrity, courage, and a persistent, unwavering commitment to the truth itself. We must be comfortable with the existence of mysteries, while at the same time refusing to let those mysteries become excuses for our own passivity in the face of injustice. As we part ways with this historical epoch, we carry with us the weight of its lessons, a weight that informs our ongoing, active, and necessary participation in the life of our own communities. We walk forward with a renewed, sharpened sense of awareness, recognizing that the light we carry is only as bright as our commitment to illuminate the darkest, most neglected corners of our own shared reality. We are the keepers of the flame, the ones who decide whether the stories of the past become cautionary tales that lead to a more just and empathetic future, or whether they are simply allowed to drift into the oblivion of forgotten trauma. The servant girl annihilator may be gone, but the societal conditions that allowed his reign to flourish, the inequality, the bias, the fear, and the profound disconnection from one another, are conditions that we must actively, continuously challenge every single day. We are the guardians of the social contract, the stewards of the community's safety, and the voices for those who were once silenced. This is our duty, this is our responsibility, and this is the promise we make to the memory of those who were lost, ensuring that their sacrifice is not forgotten, and that the light of our shared commitment to one another continues to burn, bright, unwavering, and inclusive, against the dark, encroaching, and persistent shadows of the night. The conclusion of this journey brings us back to the fundamental, sacred, and eternal truth that we are all, in our own, small, significant ways, responsible for the safety of our neighbor. The Phantom's success was built upon the isolation of his victims, on the barriers we place between ourselves and others, and on the indifference we feel toward the lives of those we deem less important than our own. By dismantling these barriers, by fostering a deep, empathetic connection to the lives of our fellow citizens, and by refusing to remain silent when we witness injustice or neglect, we build a city that is far stronger, far more resilient, and far more protective than any network of electrical towers ever could be. We find our true protection in our solidarity, in our shared humanity, and in our refusal to let the shadows dictate the conditions of our existence. The story of the servant girl annihilator is the story of a city that had to learn this lesson the hard way, through fire, through blood, and through the profound, soul-crushing experience of being hunted in its own home. It is a lesson that we, in our own time, must learn, must internalize, and must live out, ensuring that the light of our humanity is the only light that truly matters in the dark. And so, we leave the history of Austin to its ghosts, trusting that they have been heard, that they have been honored, and that they will continue to serve as a silent, vigilant presence in the development of the city. We step out of the shadows of the 19th century and back into the challenges of our own, armed with the knowledge that the past is a living, breathing entity that informs our present and shapes our future. We carry the memory of the victims with us as a source of strength, as a reminder of the fragility of our peace, and as an inspiration for the work that still remains to be done. The Phantom may have vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and a permanent, haunting legacy, but we remain, tasked with the noble, necessary, and unending labor of building a world where no one is left alone in the dark, and where the light of our shared commitment to one another is the final, ultimate, and absolute defense against the encroaching, terrifying shadows of the night. Our work continues, our watch remains, and our memory, the memory of those who were lost, endures as the final, absolute truth of this long, dark, and deeply resonant tale. The final act of this somber, century-spanning chronicle does not seek to provide a tidy resolution where none exists, nor does it attempt to impose order upon the chaotic, violent vacuum left in the wake of the servant girl annihilator. Instead, this concluding meditation serves as a testament to the endurance of memory and the profound, transformative power of confronting the darkest chapters of our shared history. We have journeyed through the freezing, mud-slicked nights of 1884 and the suffocating, terror-stricken days that followed, bearing witness to the systematic dismantling of innocence in the heart of the Texas Capitol. By navigating the intricate, often frustrating, and ultimately incomplete archives of this era, we have sought to honor the humanity of those who were lost, elevating them from the status of abstract historical figures back to the level of tangible, irreplaceable human beings. This act of remembrance is, in itself, a form of defiance against the killer, a refusal to let his desire for annihilation extend beyond the physical acts of violence to the erasure of his victims' lives from the map of our collective consciousness. We have asserted that their stories possess an intrinsic, unshakable value, and that by holding on to them, we establish a moral boundary that the phantom can no longer cross. The enduring mystery of the annihilator's identity, while an element of undeniable, dark fascination, is ultimately secondary to the systemic, societal revelations that his campaign facilitated. We have come to recognize that the true, terrifying potency of the phantom was derived from the environmental conditions of the 19th century city, conditions that were fundamentally rooted in the rigid, exclusionary, and deeply unequal social structures of the period. He was the byproduct of a society that was so deeply invested in the aesthetic of progress, in the construction of state capitals and the engineering of electrical lighting, that it inadvertently created a landscape of neglect in which a predator could roam with near total impunity. This case serves as a permanent, cautionary lesson on the necessity of universal protection, forcing us to acknowledge that a society is only as secure as its most vulnerable member. The phantom did not simply strike at individual women. He struck at the integrity of the societal promise, exposing the reality that the protection offered by the state was, for many, a conditional and unreliable entitlement. This realization remains the most potent, most challenging, and most necessary lesson of the entire saga, requiring us to be perpetually vigilant about the ways in which we define and distribute the security of our own modern world. As we look toward the future, we carry the weight of this knowledge not as a burden of cynicism, but as a framework for the construction of a more empathetic and truly inclusive justice. We understand now that the pursuit of truth is not merely a technical or legal endeavor, it is an act of communal moral courage. It requires the willingness to listen to the voices of the marginalized, the persistence to follow threads of evidence that lead to uncomfortable conclusions about the nature of our institutions, and the unwavering commitment to treat every loss of life with the same intensity of outrage and the same depth of sorrow. The servant girl annihilator has left us with a legacy of open-ended questions, but he has also left us with the necessary, ongoing work of ensuring that no one is ever again allowed to disappear into the shadows of administrative apathy or systemic neglect. We are the stewards of this mission, tasked with maintaining the light of our awareness, our compassion, and our collective responsibility against the dark, persistent, and potentially lethal shadows that continue to exist in the neglected corners of our own society. The psychological footprint of the case, meanwhile, continues to exert a profound influence on the way we conceive of our own safety, acting as a perennial baseline for the anxieties that characterize urban life. We live in a world that is far more illuminated than the Austin of the 1880s, equipped with technologies of surveillance and communication that were inconceivable to the investigators of the 19th century, yet we remain haunted by the same fundamental fear: the fear of the intruder, the fear of the unknown, and the fear of the sudden, inexplicable rupture of our personal peace. The phantom represents the prototype for this existential fear, the figure who exists outside the reach of our modern, confident systems of control. His presence in our cultural history ensures that we remain aware of the limitations of our own security, acting as a dark, sobering reminder that the world is inherently and unpredictably dangerous. This awareness should not lead us toward a life of paralyzing fear, but toward a life of profound, active engagement, where we recognize that our true safety is derived from our shared, daily commitments to one another, rather than from the walls we build or the lights we install. In the final, contemplative moments of this historical exploration, we must acknowledge the role of time in the process of reckoning. 140 years is a span sufficient to erase the specifics of a crime, to obscure the faces of the witnesses, and to settle the dust upon the records of the police, yet it is not a span sufficient to nullify the trauma of the event. The servant girl annihilator remains a presence in the present because we continue to project our own needs, our own fears, and our own moral imperatives onto the canvas of his crimes. He is a mirror for our own era, forcing us to reconcile the brutal, unvarnished history of the American frontier with the sophisticated, fragile aspirations of our contemporary society. We have learned that the past is never truly dead. It is a living, breathing influence that informs the way we interpret our own experiences and the way we construct the narratives of our own survival. We have recognized that we are not passive recipients of history, but active, ongoing authors who decide which stories to carry forward and which to cast into the oblivion of time. May the memory of those who are lost, the cook, the maid, the immigrant, the child, remain the focal point of our historical reckoning, serving as a beacon that guides our ethical engagement with the past. May their lives, so brutally stolen, continue to inspire a commitment to justice that is both proactive and truly universal. We commit ourselves to the understanding that every life is an essential, irreducible part of our shared human history, and that we have a sacred duty to protect the memory of those who are silenced, ensuring that their absence is felt, that their struggle is recognized, and that their legacy becomes an active, living component of our ongoing commitment to the truth. The Phantom has long since faded into the fog, his identity lost to the ravages of history and the inadequacies of the systems that hunted him, but the tragedy he wrought remains a permanent, sobering, and essential monument to the importance of the work we have yet to do. Our watch continues, our responsibility endures, and the light we carry, the light of empathy, the light of memory, and the light of our shared commitment to justice, remains the only barrier we possess against the darkness of the night. We step forward now into our own time, carrying the lessons of the 1880s with a renewed, sharpened sense of purpose. We acknowledge the darkness that once overwhelmed the Texas Capitol, and we acknowledge the courage of those who sought to endure it. We hold onto the history of the servant girl annihilator not to feed our own morbid curiosity, but to steel our resolve in the face of the uncertainties of our own existence. We build our societies, we design our cities, and we live our lives with a deep, humble recognition of the shadows that surround us, ensuring that we never again allow the conditions of neglect and indifference to provide a refuge for the monsters of the night. The story concludes here, but the moral imperative it represents continues, a constant, vigilant whisper in the ear of history, urging us toward the light, toward the truth, and toward a future where every single individual is protected, valued, and safe, not just by the technology of our time, but by the strength of our humanity. The Phantom is a ghost of the past, but we are the architects of the future, and it is in our hands and in our hearts that the ultimate, lasting victory against the darkness must be won, day by day and year by year, until the light of our shared humanity finally reaches every corner, ensuring that no shadow ever again possesses the power to consume the innocent.